Huh?
I charged it before.
Okay.
It used to.
Nice.
All right, well, thanks everyone for coming. I'm very excited to kick off this spring semester, I guess, of the Illuminations lectures. So just general things I want to make people aware of. All of the social media stuff. I wrote our Twitter account up here. It's @Phil_Lit_Purdue. Also, something slightly different for this semester. A lot of the Illumination lectures are going to be in Stanley Coulter 239. So all of the lectures from now until John Duvall does his in April, he'll be back in this room, but all of the interim ones will be in 239. So just slight change from our normal venue. So have a great lineup again. I've gone through it a bunch. Our next Illuminations lecture will be on February 20th, and it will be Dr. Calvin O'Shrog will be giving a lecture on, I think, the communicative turn in philosophical discourse. Is that right? Yeah, that's correct. So without further ado, this talk is really exciting for a couple of reasons. One of the things I like about the Illuminations lecture, and I like about having faculty from Purdue give presentations, is that they get to share some of their work. And Dr. Marina tonight is going to share some of the work that she's currently doing, book manuscript Kant and the Problem of Personal Identity. And some of you who were in her Kant seminar a few semesters ago, we've seen some of this work, and I'm really interested in it. So personal identity is one of my things that I study as well. So very good. So yeah, Dr. Jacqueline Marina got her PhD from Yale University. She's the author of several books for a transformation of the self and the thought of Friedrich Schleiermacher from Oxford University Press. Also the Cambridge Companion to Friedrich Schleiermacher, of course, from Cambridge. Her most recent article is Transcendental Arguments for Personal Identity and Kant's Transcendental Deduction, which was in Philo, I believe in the fall, winter of 2012. And before that, Schleiermacher on the outpourings of the inner fire, experiential expressivism, and religious pluralism, in addition to several book chapters and articles. So, without further ado, Dr. Jacqueline Marina.
Thank you for being with me here tonight. And I have a lot here, so I'm condensing parts of this manuscript and I'm going to have to be skipping sections. Hopefully that's not going to be a huge problem. So this is on the refutation of idealism, and one of the things that I want to show as I discuss Kant is that Kant's refutation of idealism is the importance of embodiment. For Kant and his refutation of idealism. Okay, so this is from the third, or I think it's the third or fourth chapter. I can't even remember now. Okay. The previous chapter dealt with what I've called the a priori reflected self-consciousness, and I'll be sort of recapping things. This is the I think that must be able to accompany all my representations, and which is a condition of the possibility of judgment. It results from reflection on the self's immediate awareness of itself and its activity of thought. In the immediate awareness of my activity of thought, the synthetic original unity of apperception, I am conscious of only that I am. However, I am also capable of reflecting on the successive acts of synthesis through which I am immediately aware of my existence, and bringing those to a unity. This reflection yields the I think. Three things are important in this regard. First, the I think that must be able to accompany all my representations is more than the immediate awareness that I am. It involves the capacity of the self to make itself its own object, that is, the capacity of becoming aware of itself as the self having a representation. Second, because this awareness of self is a condition of the possibility of judgment, it must be given a priori and must be distinguished from the empirical self-consciousness. Third, this a priori reflected self-consciousness has an a priori content. For it is the result of the understandings bringing the forms of intuition to a unity, making possible the projection of a single temporal horizon in which my successive acts of synthesis are ordered, and a single spatial horizon through which phenomenal substances can interact with me. Through the temporal horizon, the I is not only capable of grasping past acts of syntheses as its own, it also projects itself forward into a future that is not yet. Through the spatial horizon, I grasp myself as having a point of view. That is, I understand myself as capable of being oriented in space and thereby standing in relation to other substances. As I noted in the last chapter, it is important to keep in mind that I cannot represent the temporal horizon without also representing the spatial one. This theme also plays an important role in the subject of this chapter, the refutation of idealism. And just a side note, those of you that are into Sartre will see how much Sartre has taken over some of these ideas, you know, with the issue of the immediate awareness of the I think through the acts of thinking, and then reflection on your past acts of thinking, right? And it's through reflection on these past acts of thinking that the temporal manifold is going to be generated. In this chapter, I focus on Kant's refutation of idealism, dealing as it does with the conditions of the possibility of ordering the given contents of inner sense. And the given contents of inner sense is just going to be, again, those acts of synthesis, of your own past acts of synthesis that you are reflecting upon. It ultimately has to do with the empirical self. Through inner sense, the self is aware of its representations as its own. These are given representations, and as such, the contents of inner sense are already determinate and depend upon experience. This is in contrast to what I have called the a priori reflected self, whose content is the forms of intuition in relation to original apperception as unified through the understanding. Becoming conscious of the contents of inner sense is only possible insofar as I have an a priori awareness of myself as orientable in space and as persisting through alterations of inner sense. Through my reflection on the contents of inner sense and their relation to what is given in outer sense, I come upon the empirical self-consciousness. While the empirical self-consciousness must be strictly differentiated from the a priori consciousness of self discussed in the previous chapter, consciousness of the I think, it is important to keep in mind that this a priori consciousness of self conditions the possibility of empirical self-consciousness. So in other words, there's going to be an a priori consciousness of the self that you must have if you're going to be able to have any kind of empirical awareness of the self. And the empirical awareness of the self is awareness that depends on the actual, actual experiences that you have. The refutation makes clear a number of important points regarding the interrelations of the empirical self as given in inner sense, and the a priori functions of thought necessary for time determination, especially as these are worked through in the analogies of experience. In what follows, first I discuss the nature of inner sense and its relation to outer sense, the role it plays in Kant's conception of the self, and its central place in Kant's refutation of idealism. Second, I provide an in-depth analysis of the argument of the refutation of idealism as it is put forward in the B edition of the first critique. I argue that when properly understood, the refutation persuasively demonstrates that inner experience presupposes the a priori awareness of the self as orientable in space and as thereby able to stand in relation to things distinct from the self in space. So these are some preliminary considerations, and they're really important. I just want to talk about apperception, inner sense, and outer sense. Kant's remarks on inner sense are scattered throughout the first critique and numerous other writings, especially his Anthropology and Reflexionen. In the aesthetic of the first critique, Kant defines inner sense as follows. Quote, inner sense, by means of which the mind intuits itself, or its inner state, gives, to be sure, no intuition of the soul itself as an object, yet it it is still a determinate form under which the intuition of its inner state is alone possible, so that everything that belongs to the inner determinations is represented in relations of time. Unquote. Right away, several important questions pop up. First, what does Kant mean when he tells us that through inner sense, the mind intuits its inner state, but inner sense gives us no intuition of the soul itself as an object? Second, how does Kant understand time as a form of intuition in which inner determinations are ordered? We have already noted that a fundamental starting point of the first critique is that the simple representation I has no manifold of its own. On the other hand, inner sense has a manifold and must be carefully distinguished from apperception. In the Anthropology, Kant tells us that while apperception is, quote, a consciousness of what we are doing, unquote, inner sense is a, quote, a consciousness of what we undergo insofar as we are affected by the play of our own thoughts, unquote. Apperception is the activity of thought. We have an immediate awareness of this activity. However, since the mind is active on material that comes from a source distinct from itself, awareness of this activity does not provide us with any cognition of the mind as substance from which this activity might originate. This description of apperception echoes Kant's comment in the Transcendental Deduction regarding the immediate awareness of myself and my activity, the that I am, which, however, has no manifold of its own. As noted in the previous chapter, the fact that through the I, this is a quote, quote, through the I, as a simple representation, nothing manifold is given, unquote, this constitutes one of the central problems of the Transcendental Deduction. Inner sense, however, clearly has a manifold. What then is the origin of this manifold? Kant tells us that the contents of inner sense derive from what is given in outer sense. In the preface, he notes that we, quote, get the whole matter for our cognitions, even for our inner sense, unquote, from the existence of things outside us. Much the same point is made at B67, where Kant notes that, quote, the representations of outer sense make up the proper material with which we occupy our mind, unquote. Now, several points follow from the derivative character of the contents of inner sense. First, because the contents of inner sense come from outer sense, the soul does not intuit itself through inner sense, but rather makes its representations of the objects of outer sense its objects. Second, the nature of the content given in outer sense has an impact on the character of the contents of inner sense. Because these contents are nothing other than what is given through outer sense, yet made into objects of my intentional awareness qua representations, the relational character of what is given in outer sense is also present in inner sense, albeit mediately. To understand inner sense, we must therefore understand outer sense. Kant notes that through outer sense, quote, we represent to ourselves objects as outside us and all as in space. In space, their shape, magnitude, and relation to one another is determined or determinable, unquote. Space is that which makes it possible for objects to be relatable to one another. It's very important. For only through space can they be grasped as coexisting. So Kant, quote, space is the representation of a mere possibility of coexistence, unquote. Only if this possibility of the coexistence of two distinct substances is already established can I then relate myself to something outside of me and have a perception of it, for perception presupposes both simultaneity and influence. As such, Kant famously argues that space must be an a priori form of intuition, that is, it must already be presupposed if I am to cognize anything as being outside of me. So this is a long quote. For in order for certain sensations to be related to something outside me, that is, to something in another place and space from that in which I find myself. Thus, in order to represent them as outside one another, thus not merely as different, but in different places, the representation of space must already be their ground. This is the idea that space is an a priori intuition. A similar point is made in the Leningrad fragment on Innersense. Quote, the consciousness of our receptivity with respect to the inner or outer grounds of the determination of our representations and the forms of sensible intuition bound up with them must exist in us a priori. Unquote. Kant notes further, quote, I must be able to be conscious of myself as standing in an a priori relation to other things even before my perception of them. Unquote. The possibility of my relation to what is outer must first be presupposed if perception is to be possible at all. Only if I am first conscious of my receptivity as one that relates to objects outside of me can I understand myself as distinct from and in relation to the objects given to me in perception. The perception of objects thereby presupposes an a priori awareness of myself as orientable in space and capable of standing in relation to things outside of me. This is a pure a priori consciousness of self. In other words, it's not empirically derived. It is the condition of the possibility of your having any kind of empirical awareness. Before more is said on the interrelations of the contents of outer and inner sense, it is necessary to keep in mind that Kant held that inner and outer sense are two irreducibly distinct forms of intuition. While the contents of inner sense are derived from the outer sense, neither form of intuition is reducible to the other. Let us call this the irreducibility thesis. This is very, very important. Space and time are irreducible to one another. It is an essential component of Kant's transcendental idealism and key to what he seeks to prove in the Refutation of Idealism. In Reflexion 56-53, in which Kant comments on the B version of the Refutation, he notes that problematic idealism, so this is what he's going to be arguing against, problematic idealism, and these are the presuppositions of problematic idealism. Quote, problematic idealism is based on this, that we are immediately conscious of our own existence, but conscious of outer things only through an inference from the immediate consciousness of mere representations of things outside us to their existence, which inference, however, is not self-evident in its conclusion, as is proven by the well-known property of our imagination, which is a faculty for intuitively representing objects even without their presence. So that's what he wants to refute, is that idea of problematic idealism. And again, in problematic idealism, the idea is that you have an immediate awareness of the contents of inner sense, and then you just infer from inner sense to the objects of outer sense. But that inference is always doubtful, right? Because you never can move from just, the mind to what's out there. You could all just be, you could be in a matrix for all you know, right? In refuting idealism, Kant seeks to show three things. First, insofar as we make ourselves and our representations our own object, we cannot be conscious of ourselves immediately. That is, we have no immediate awareness of the contents of inner sense, insofar as these can become the intentional objects of our awareness. So this is one of the fundamental ways that he's going to refute, let's say, Cartesian problematic idealism, is by saying we don't have an immediate awareness of the contents of inner sense. Second, there is a contradiction in thinking that we can infer the existence of outer things from what is given in inner sense. The idea that making such an inference involves a contradiction is tied to the irreducibility thesis, namely the claim that the form of outer sense cannot be reduced to or inferred from the form of inner sense. As we shall see, Kant argues that to believe amounts to the notion that the representation of space can be reduced to or inferred from the representation of time, and it is this reduction or inference which he claims is contradictory. Third, consciousness of ourselves as intentional objects of our awareness is always immediate and depends upon an a priori immediate awareness of the self as spatial and as standing in relation to outer things. Key to an understanding of Kant's position, and closely tied to the irreducibility thesis, is his claim that outer sense is given to me immediately. I am immediately aware of myself as orientable in space and capable of standing in relation to things outside me. It is the mistaken assumption that outer sense and the objects given to our awareness in it are somehow derivable from inner sense alone that grounds problematic idealism. For Kant, on the contrary, outer sense is, quote, a faculty for being conscious of something outside of us immediately without an inference of reason, and of being conscious of ourself by contrast in relation to it, unquote. Outer sense is a, quote, special, he calls it a special sense, through which I am able to become conscious of myself in an outer relation. That's his definition of outer sense. As such, the real in space is immediately given through empirical intuition. We do not infer the real in space from what is given in inner sense. While we have an immediate consciousness of outer sense, we cannot have an immediate awareness of the succession of our temporal states, since such an awareness involves self-reflection, self-consciousness, that is, consciousness of self as an intentional object and the conditions of its possibility. Kant will claim that one of the conditions of the possibility of such self-consciousness is the immediate a priori awareness of the self as spatial and as standing in possible commercial with other things, that is, as capable of standing in an outer relation. And of course, that means embodiment. While neither form of intuition can be reduced to the other, we have already noted the dependent character of the contents of inner intuition on what is outwardly given. As such, there is a priority of outer sense over inner sense in regard to content. There is, however, a very significant sense in which there is a priority of outer sense over inner sense in regard to form as well, or at least in regard to the possibility of time becoming a formal intuition for us. Recall that the permanent is intuitable only in space. In time, as sheer form of intuition, all we have is succession, as such duration, necessary for us to think of a magnitude. As such, duration, necessary for us to think of a magnitude, cannot be cognized at all. In Reflexion 56-53, Kant notes, and this is a quote, a long quote, quote, the representation of space is the ground of the representation of time on account of persistence. Likewise, only in it can one acquire a representation of time as a magnitude through a line that I draw, while I am conscious of my existence in the subject. Now, that which persists cannot be merely thought in the determination of time and belong to the spontaneity of self-determination, for then it would not be the basis of the determination of time. In other places, that is in the first critique and in the letter to Regberg, Kant will not so much speak of the grounding of time and space as of the necessary synthesis of space and time as conditions of the possibility of empirical self-consciousness. Let us call this the necessary synthesis thesis. Especially important for the refutation, however, is the argument that consciousness of time as formal intuition presupposes an immediate intuition of ourselves as spatially situated and in commercial with things outside of us. And as will become clear in the next chapter, the necessary synthesis thesis moves beyond the simple claim that consciousness of time presupposes the immediate intuition of space. It also implies that this synthesis is only achieved through the categories. Both the thesis of irreducibility and that of necessary synthesis are central to the refutation, and their precise role in it are discussed in more detail below. The necessary synthesis thesis has major implications for the nature of inner experience. In order to understand these, it is first necessary to further analyze the nature of what is given in outer sense. Recall that only through outer sense is it possible to grasp two substances simultaneously and in relation or commercio with one another. From this understanding of space, Kant draws some remarkable conclusions regarding the nature of what is cognized in both space and inner experience. The long passage at B67 is extremely important for both Kant's transcendental idealism and his rejection of empirical idealism. There he notes that first, what is given to outer sense concerns nothing but mere relations, that is, substances insofar as they stand in relation to one another, and second, that since inner experience is only possible on condition of an a priori necessary synthesis between the two forms of intuition, all that we cognize through inner experience are mere relations as well. Kant notes, so this is the very important passage at B67. Everything in our cognition that belongs to intuition, with the exception, therefore, of the feeling of pleasure and displeasure of the will, which are not cognitions at all, concern nothing but mere relations of places in one intuition, extension, alteration of places, motion, and laws in accordance with which this alteration is determined, moving forces. But what is present in the place, or what it produces in the things themselves besides the alteration of place, is not given through these relations. Now, through mere relations, no thing in itself is cognized. It is therefore right to judge that since nothing is given to us through outer sense except mere representations of relation, outer sense can also contain in its representation only the representation of an object to the subject and not that which is internal to the object in itself. This is, the ground of the transcendental idealism. It is exactly the same in the case of inner sense. It is not merely that the representations of outer sense make up the proper material with which we occupy our mind and so forth. Okay, so again, that's really, really central. All we cognize are going to be these relations. We have no access to the inner determinations of a thing outside of its relation to us. All we know in both outer and inner sense are mere relations. This is true of outer sense, since through its objects are not only, this is true of outer sense, since through it, objects are not only spatially situated in relation to one another, but they are also spatially situated in relation to me. Through outer sense, objects are given to our faculty of perception and are only cognized through it. Our own contribution to the cognition of outer objects, for instance, our capacity to be affected by them in certain ways, must be taken into account in what goes to constitute the given character of our perceptions. We therefore know such objects and their determinations only insofar as they stand in relation to us. Furthermore, insofar as outer objects are spatially situated in relation to one another, this relation implies that they are in commercio with one another, so that whatever properties each object exhibits can only be fully understood insofar as it is related to the properties of other substances coexisting with it. Now, all that is given in inner sense are mere relations as well. There are two important reasons for this. First is the priority of the contents of outer sense. Inner sense gets its contents from outer sense. How does it do so? The objects of inner awareness are my representations of outer objects qua representations. In other words, the intentional objects of inner awareness are no longer outer objects. They are rather my representations of such outer objects. Given that the characteristics of outer objects are partly determined through my faculty of receptivity, how they are given to me, and hence how I will cognize them, is determined only in their relation to me. For this reason, the objects of inner sense can only be representations of objects as these objects stand in relation to me. What I become aware of in inner experience through reflection on my representations and how they relate to what is given to me through outer experience is thereby my perspective on the world. Allison has aptly noted that inner experience is a, quote, reflexive reappropriation, unquote, of the contents of outer sense. That is, it results from the capacity of the mind to focus its attention on its representations qua representations. Here, one turns one's attention away from the object given in outer sense as intentional object, and redirects one's attention to the representations themselves. As such, the representations then become the intentional objects of my awareness. This turning of one's attention to the representations themselves is one of the primary methodological principles employed by Husserl. Kant, of course, does not go the route of the phenomenological appliqué, but instead emphasizes that not only are the contents of inner experience made possible through outer sense, the two forms of intuition are necessarily bound up with one another, and that as such, empirical idealism is contradictory. Because all the contents of inner sense are derived from outer sense, the eye cannot know itself through inner sense. Through inner sense, it grasps only its perspective on the world, but attains no knowledge of itself as it is in itself. In fact, the self, insofar as it is considered pure activity of thought, cannot appear to itself at all. Kant's second reason for his claim that in inner sense, all that is given are mere relations is no less important. It concerns the doctrine of self-affection and its relation to temporal experience. As we shall see, it is here that the necessary synthesis thesis plays a crucial role. How is it possible for me to direct my attention to my representations themselves so that they, instead of outer objects in space, become the objects of my intentional awareness? According to Kant, it is only through self-affection and the conditions of its possibility. This is the subject of the passage immediately following the one just analyzed. So again, the issue is, how is it possible for me to direct attention to my own representations and not just to be immediately or aware of like a table out there, but think about my representation at the table. It is not merely that the representations of, this is Kant, it is not merely that the representations of outer sense make up the proper material with which we occupy our mind, but also the time in which we place these representations, which itself precedes the consciousness of them in experience and grounds the way in which we place them in the mind as a formal condition, already contains relations of succession, of simultaneity, and of that which is simultaneous with succession, of that which persists. Now that which, as representation, can precede any act of thinking something isn't, now that which, as representation, can precede any act of thinking something is intuition, and, if it contains nothing but relations, is the form of intuition, which, since it does not represent anything except insofar as something is posited in the mind, can be nothing other than the way in which the mind is affected by its own activity, namely this positing of its representation, thus the way it is affected through itself, that is, it is an inner sense as regards its form. Everything that is represented through a sense is to that extent always appearance, and an inner sense must therefore, An inner sense must therefore not be admitted at all, or else the subject, which is the object of the sense, can only be represented by its means as appearance, not as it would judge of itself if its intuition were mere self-activity, that is intellectual. So again, this is the doctrine of self-affection. So that whatever we're conscious of in inner sense is always going to be a result of self-affection, and therefore we don't have any access to ourselves as we are in ourselves. Two things are notable here, both interrelated. Kant's characterization of time and his doctrine of self-affection. His understanding of both is key to the following problem. How can a representation be posited in the mind in such a way that it, qua representation, becomes the object of my awareness? So in other words, that I am aware that I am having a representation. How can I take such a representation as a determinate intuition? The importance of such a question cannot be underestimated, for empirical experience is only possible if I am able to distinguish myself both from my representations and the objects of my awareness. Only through these distinctions is cognition of an object possible. For this reason, while there is a certain priority of outer sense over inner sense, and that outer sense supplies the contents of inner sense and the grounding of time and space, outer experience of objects is itself only possible on the condition of inner experience through which I can become aware of and reflect upon my representations qua representations. Without this capacity, I would not be able to distinguish myself and my point of view from the outer object given to my empirical awareness, and so cognition of outer objects qua objects would be impossible. What then are the conditions of the possibility of this inner experience? Time, according to Kant, grounds the way that we place representations in the mind as a formal condition. Notably, in the passage at B67, he characterizes time as containing, quote, relations of succession, of simultaneity, and of that which is simultaneous with succession, of that which persists, unquote. However, in other significant passages, Kant characterizes inner sense and its form differently. Quote, time, however, and thus everything that is in inner sense, constantly flows. Quote, there is no persistent intuition to be found in inner sense, unquote. Inner sense is a stream of inner appearances which can provide no standing or abiding self. In these passages, Kant does not include the relations of simultaneity and the persistence, of simultaneity and persistence as included within time. In order to reconcile these two divergent accounts of inner sense and its form, we must turn to Kant's doctrine of self-affection. And Kant is really frustrating because he does have these two, he does this with many things, these two different conceptions of time, and he doesn't, tell you, I'm using this one now, or not. So you have to sort of figure all of this out. Okay. Time can be considered in two ways. On the one hand, insofar as time is considered as a mere form of intuition, its manifold is offered only successively. Right? So there's that issue. If it's only that, then it's just mere succession. Just as Kant argued that percepts without concepts are blind, the temporal form of intuition by itself, tied as it is to sensation, is also blind. It is a sheer, indeterminate manifold. On the other hand, as this chapter will make clear, we cannot even become aware of time or of the successive character of our representations without the action of the understanding of the temporal manifold. Awareness of the temporal manifold as intentional object can only be accomplished through what Kant calls the figurative synthesis, and here we already have the action of the understanding on inner sense. At bottom of the figurative synthesis is the necessary a priori synthesis of space and time. This is the upshot of Kant's distinction in the footnote to paragraph 26 between a form of intuition. So a form of intuition is that which merely gives the manifold, and a, quote, formal intuition, which gives the unity of the representation. So you can have two senses of time as a mere form of intuition, or you can talk about it as a formal intuition, and there the understanding has already worked upon the temporal manifold. This action of the understanding on inner sense just is the way that we must affect ourselves in order for time to become a formal intuition for us, or for it to be grasped in terms of the unity of the representation. As I will argue in more detail below, I must first be conscious of time as a formal intuition if it is to be possible for me to posit my representations, that is, for me to become conscious of a representation. The inner sense is a mere form of intuition, sheer indeterminate manifold, and the figurative synthesis yielding time as a formal intuition is also discussed in paragraph 24 of the B deduction. Quote, apperception and its synthetic unity is so far from being the same as the inner sense that the former, rather, as the source of all combination, applies to all sensible intuition of objects in general, to the manifold of intuitions in general, under the form of the categories. Inner sense, on the contrary, contains the mere form of intuition, but without combination of the manifold in it, and thus it does not yet contain any determinate intuition at all, which is possible only through the consciousness of the determination of the manifold through the transcendental action of the imagination, namely the synthetic influence of the understanding of the inner sense, which I have named the figurative synthesis. So again, the distinction is going to be between time is like as a sheer indeterminate manifold, where all you have is succession, and then time, which is time as we already understand it as an intentional object of awareness, which is going to be dependent on what Kant calls the figurative synthesis. And that figurative synthesis is really going to be a synthesis of the understanding, a necessary synthesis by the understanding on the two forms of intuition, space and time. Here, inner sense is portrayed as containing only the materials for reflecting upon our own state. By itself, inner sense contains only what is given through sensation, as such in itself. So inner sense by itself does not yet exhibit a combination of the manifold in it. You get a combination through the figurative synthesis. It therefore does not yet contain any determinate intuition at all. Combination can only be supplied through the activity of apperception and its synthetic unity. That is, apperception brings the contents of inner sense to a unity through the figurative synthesis. Once the contents of inner sense are brought to such a unity, inner experience results. Kant here makes another very significant claim, almost in passing. Combination of the manifold of inner sense is necessary for there to be determinate intuitions in inner sense. In other words, in order for it to be possible for a representation to become an intentional object of my awareness, combination of the manifold of inner sense must be presupposed. How such combination of the manifold of inner sense is possible through the figurative synthesis is the key to Kant's refutation of idealism. It also reveals the way in which combination is necessary in order for me to become conscious of determinate intuitions in inner sense, that is, in order for me to make my representations into intentional objects of my awareness. What is the figurative synthesis and what does it involve? In it, there is a necessary a priori synthesis of the two forms of intuition, space and time. In the preface to the B edition, Kant notes, quote, the reality of outer sense is necessarily bound up with that of inner sense, unquote. Only through this synthesis is the a priori awareness of myself as a subject, which can be affected by objects outside of me, and which can become conscious of my representations about them, possible. In his letter to Rydberg, Kant notes, quote, the necessity of the synthesis of the two forms of sensibility, space and time, in determining the objects of our intuition, so that time, when the subject makes himself the object of his representations, must be imagined as a line if it is to be quantified. Just as, on the other hand, a line can be quantified only by being constructed in time. This insight of the necessary synthesis of inner sense with outer sense, even in the determination of the time of our existence, seems to me of aid in proving the objective reality of our representations of outer things as against psychological idealism, though I am not able to pursue this idea further at this moment. These claims are central to Kant's refutation of idealism. An important argument strand is the following. If the subject is to make herself the object of her representations, she must understand herself as existing in time. But in order to do so, she must think of herself as that which endures throughout her changing representations. insofar as space is that through which the permanent in existence is represented, the representation of time involves the representation of space. Hence, she must represent the time that she endures through a line. A similar point is made in two important passages in the first critique, analyzed in much more depth below in the context of the Refutation of Idealism. What is important to keep in mind at this point, however, is that Kant will argue that the figurative synthesis involves the necessary interconnection between space and time. Action of the understanding on inner sense is only possible on condition of a necessary synthesis of inner and outer sense. As I show below, this necessary interconnection is the decisive idea in Kant's Refutation of Idealism. And so I think, I thought I was going to be able to read like another section, but I'm seeing that, let me see how many pages it is, because otherwise it may be the case that there's enough here that we can discuss. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, this may be too much. Yeah, so I think that maybe we can just leave it here, and I'll just try to bring out some of the other arguments. There's enough here, basically, you know, the discussion of the irreducibility thesis, and the necessary synthesis thesis. And so both of these theses are going to be absolutely crucial to Kant's refutation of idealism. And again, the idea, to recap, is that only insofar as the two forms of intuition are which are irreducible to one another, are synthesized a priori by us through the categories, right? Is it possible for us to even have an understanding of what it means to an a priori understanding of the self, right, that endures through time, right? And only if you already have that understanding of a self that endures through time can you even begin to think of what it means for you to also have representations, a self that think of yourself as a self that has representations, and you need to be able to that is always presupposed in any kind of judgment, right? I am looking at the table. If I say I'm looking at the table, I already need to know, I'm already making several distinctions there between the object, between myself, right, and the representations that I'm having through which I'm aware that I'm looking at the table, right? So the idea is that there has to be an a priori activity through which these two forms of intuition are synthesized, which is going to give you, which are going to be very important in this a priori reflected self that I'm talking about, which is a condition of the possibility of there being an empirical self.
Okay. Sorry, but yeah, real quick, we'll take like a 5-minute break.
Yeah.
Is that all right? And then,
yeah, that's fine.
Reconvene for questions. All right, so just 2 quick announcements. Again, our next talk is Dr. Calvin Schrag, February the 20th. That is in Stanley Coulter 239. The 2 following that will also be in Stanley Coulter 239. And if you go to the Phil Lit website, the events page, all the titles and times and locations of the talks for this semester, the Spring 2014 Illuminations program, is available. So you can check that out for future reference. I think we'll open it up for Q&A for Dr. Marina.
Okay. I'm just realizing that there were some really important, things that I didn't get to read.
Or maybe we'll open it up for more reading.
I might just because some of the questions are certainly going to get to, well, what is the actual argument that I just sort of sketched? And I will at least read, once the questions are asked, just a passage from Kant himself on that, how he's trying to argue for this idea that, which is the central idea, that you can't have an understanding of time, where full-bodied understanding of time, where time is an object of intentional awareness without the necessary synthesis between space and time. And so the distinction would be between that, sort of like, what would I want to call it, just time as mere form of intuition. And time insofar as it's just a mere form of intuition, just tied to sensation, where you still haven't, tied to sensation so that it's a form of intuition for the receptivity of sensation, without yet the understanding working on it. It's just going to be mere succession. And if you think about, well, what happens if all you have is mere succession? Well, you can't even be conscious of mere succession because you're just always lost in the next, you yourself are always lost in each moment of succession. So in order for us to really have an understanding of time, you at least need to be able to think of something that changes, that remains the same throughout some kind of alterations, right? So that you're not lost in the alterations, but you think that the alterations, this is, for Kant, the awareness of time is always going to be tied to the idea that there is a substance that's changing, and that substance that's changing is also in commercio with other substances that are changing. So, and that I, of course, didn't get to read all of that. It's a very long argument. But that is the upshot, right? That he wants to argue that in order to have an understanding of time, you already need to have this understanding of the permanent. You need to have an understanding of substance. Substance as that which remains the same while its properties change. And you also need to be able to think of these different substances in commercio with one another, and you also need to think of yourself as an embodied self in commercio with objects outside of you. So anyway, I guess since I talked about that, let me just throw this one little passage of Kant. This is Kant himself out, so we can, if need be, you can talk about, you can ask questions about this. So this is from B291, 292, and he says, in order to exhibit alteration as the intuition corresponding to the concept of causality, we must take motion as alteration in space as our example. Indeed, only by that means can we make alterations, the possibility of which cannot but be comprehended by any pure understanding, intuitable. Alteration is the combination of contradictorily opposed determinations in the existence of one and the same thing. Now, how is it possible that from a given state, an opposed state of the same thing should follow, not only cannot be made comprehensible by reason without example, but cannot even be made understandable without intuition, and this intuition is the intuition of a point in space, the existence of which in different places, as a sequence of opposed determinations, first makes alteration intuitable to us, for in order subsequently to make even inner alterations thinkable, we must be able to grasp time as the form of inner sense figuratively through a line, and grasp the inner alteration through the drawing of this line motion, and thus grasp the successive existence of ourself in different states through outer intuition, the real ground of which is that all alteration presupposes something that persists in intuition, even in order merely to be perceived as alteration, but there is no persistent intuition in inner sense. That's really the fundamental idea from which he's going to take the whole refutation of idealism, that there's no persistent intuition in inner sense alone. And therefore you always have to, in order to even be conscious of yourself as having representations of alteration, you have to already make reference to things that persist in space and in relation to one another. So, okay.
This is not my area on it. Let me ask you a simple-minded question. Tell me, is this true of Kant? To be able to represent the external world, you have to have the capacity to represent yourself as an enduring substance to yourself.
Yeah, I think that you would argue that.
Okay.
That in other words, you have to think of yourself as in space,
Yeah, okay, great, that's
especially
enough.
as in commercial.
All right, good. Then how about my dog? So Kant is stuck, it seems to me, either saying, basically, since beliefs, I take it, are paradigmatic representations. There are others, but that's kind of a paradigmatic one.
Mhm.
Then it seems to be either saying dogs don't have any beliefs, or dogs do have the capacity for this kind of self-reflection. So
I think that you would have to say that it's going to be a gradual kind of, so dogs are going to have some kind of capacity. But that's a good question, yeah.
to reflect upon that.
Yeah, you're going to have, well, I mean, that's also, that's also something that you can sort of test to see, how
Oh, I don't
where
have
they
any
are.
question my dog has beliefs about the squirrel. They made beliefs about the squirrel. I have some doubts whether
Right.
he thinks of himself as, boy, I really love chasing the squirrel. I thought self-reflexive thoughts,
Yeah.
I'm not so sure about. So it's it seems to me that he's kind of in a bad, Kant is kind of in a bad spot there. I mean, he doesn't think much of animals normally.
No, wait a minute, because, I guess what you're saying is, you're saying that I'm saying something that he didn't say.
Well, I thought you were telling me to have the representation of an external object.
No,
be
to know,
able
but it's to know that it is that. We're talking here about the capacity to, you're already talking about the capacity to have to know that you're having a representation.
How about just to have a representation?
Dogs could just have representations, but
Oh,
the issue
okay.
the issue is that you know that you are having a representation.
But I thought...
And that would be, so these would be conditions of the possibility of judgment.
Well,
So the dog can have a representation, in other words, so you can have a representation, I suppose, and not know that you're having a representation.
Well, maybe that's so, but I thought he's committed to thinking that even in order to have a representation, not to know about it, just to have it, you have to have a conception of yourself as an enduring substance. That's what I was like.
I don't know if he's he's going to say, so in the transcendental deduction, he's going to say, it must be possible for the I think to accompany,
Right,
all of
and
my
that's kind of a
representations, and that's what we're
self-reflective
talking about, what are the conditions of the possibility of that. So whether it's the case that a dog, what is involved in a dog's mental states is the dog having a representation. They just act, I suppose you can say, well, they have, I don't know exactly about what's the latest on dogs. But
But don't you think the dog
dog
recognizes you rather than some stranger? And has
yeah, but there's many different ways that you can account for that kind of behavior, right? So
There
you
is,
can
but-
say, you can give some kind of behaviorist. I'm not that I'm going to, but you can give many accounts of what a dog is doing, and it's a very complicated story to even say, well, if the dog does have beliefs, okay, what is the nature of those beliefs? And could it be the case that, I believe, and I believe that, yes, a dog has beliefs, and I believe that it's not, when you're talking about the nature of believing or having beliefs with different kinds of animals, that it's probably, it's not like there's these major jumps, but that there's like, it's incremental, right? So that they have some kinds of beliefs. I don't know exactly how one would talk about, the nature of their beliefs. Maybe they're more immediate. They're not thinking to themselves, oh, what did I do yesterday? Yeah.
Right.
Am I a bad dog or am I a good dog? I don't think they do that like we do.
Yeah, but all right, I don't want to press. Just let me say one more thing. If you want to go the incremental route of
Right.
beliefs, then it seems to me you'd have to go the incremental route about self-awareness.
No, because you can, I mean, you can still say, well, you know, this feature comes online, and this feature comes online, and this feature comes online, right? You can, and then you can sort of say what they are, what's coming online at a particular time, to use the new. You know, in other words, what aspects of cognition are all of a sudden are a new feature of your toolbox? And then, you know, and I'm moving way beyond cognition. Right, but it's a good, I mean, that's a really good question.
No,
it's a really good question. So, but I don't
Good
think
questions or questions
that
about dogs?
the dog has the capacity. So one of the things that I talked about that's very important is this issue about how is it possible for me to be aware, you know, the kind of consciousness that we have is one of the things that we can do, is that instead of just thinking, oh, there's a you know, oh, I'm going to go, okay, I'm a dog. I go over there, grab a cookie, you know, right. That's, but what we can do...
You can think about that thought.
I can think about that.
I agree.
And the dog does not do that. I don't think the dog does that.
Probably not. And all I'm saying, I thought Kant required that extra step in order to have representations at all.
No, I don't think so. No, it's in order for there... When that passage in 16, paragraph 16, sorry, it's the I think, the famous passage, the I think, it must be possible for the I think to accompany,
I actually remember
right,
reading that. No.
all of my representations.
I have read that.
That,
right, well that seems to say
that whole discussion is, it must be possible for the I think to accompany all of my representations in the context of the possibility of, what is the conditions of the possibility of our making judgments. And that's already, to make a judgment already requires that I be aware that I'm having representations, right, that these are representations. The dog is not doing that. So he would say the dog is not making judgments in the way that we make judgments. Okay? Sorry.
Doesn't Kant, too, just try to limit himself to think consciousness like me? Like, all I can say is, like, if it's like I am. So how much would he really want... I mean, I'm asking you to kind of speak for Kant, which might not be fair. I mean, but how far could we really speculate on, like, the nature of other, like, think of the what it's like to be a bat type of scenarios? I mean, isn't he sort of, like, as, like, this kind of, you know, consciousness?
I mean, you could still do some of that by just, you know, sort of speculating, well, what happens if I can't think of the I think as a company on my representations?
Okay.
You know, so you can speculate, well, what if I can't do that? You know, what am I left with?
So I've got a question about the claim that space makes objects relatable because it's the condition of possibility of coexistence.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I agree this is Kant's view, but I can't agree that it's plausible, right? So let me dust off an old counterexample, right? Strawson's music, right? Seems like I can have a coexistence of notes in a chord that sound at a given time. I have, if my ear is sufficiently well trained, I have no difficulty distinguishing the notes as separate objects. Doesn't seem like I need to think of them as spatial or experience them as spatial. I mean, I think the same example cuts against Kant's notions of substance and the idea that you need something unchangeable in order to be able to experience change, but put that off to the side for the moment. I mean, what do you think about Strawson's idea that the music example, it doesn't seem spatial at all.
Yeah, but
right?
I think that...
It seems like coexistence is easy.
I think that, you know, this is what I would say. I would defend Kant and say that if you can, you know, really distinguish, when you hear a chord, that you can really distinguish that it is a chord and know that there are several notes that coexist, that this presupposes a kind of experience where you already have a sense of spatiality, that you already would have, that you already have, as a musician, you have been at the piano, you've hit this note and that note. I mean, I know, and my son is a pianist, right? And I've seen all of his training and how it's happened. You know, first it is with the single notes and getting a sense of what the single notes, and seeing the single notes on the page with the staff, how they work together, right? And then you're able, because you have that, you have that training, then it's very easy to say, oh, I hear these 3 notes in this chord. I don't think that if you did not have that training, if you didn't have all of that experience, all of that experience, which presupposes a spatial world, that you would be able to distinguish the notes.
So you're willing to back this up to a kind of genetic claim, right? That it must be that I have to have some sort of past experience, that the coexistence of the notes themselves doesn't have to be spatial at all. Just has to be that there's some spatial experience in the history of my capacity that is necessary.
Right.
I mean, that seems a lot weaker than Kant's claim, though, which is a kind of conceptual claim about coexistence, right?
No, I don't think that it's that much weaker. I mean, so in order to be able to hear 3 separate notes, why can I hear 3 separate notes? Because I have, I have all of this.
I don't have to be able to experience them as spatial in order to experience them as different yet coexistence.
Not at the moment.
Okay.
No, but you would have had to have some kind of spatial experience, I would say. And you would have had to be able to.
Yeah, that strikes me as too weak to get what Kant wants for these necessary syntheses.
I don't think so.
I mean, then the space and time could come apart in experience a good bit, right? I mean, they could...
No, they're still not going to be coming apart.
Well, sure, right? I mean, I'm having this purely temporal experience, right, with no spatial elements to it.
But what he's saying...
The content is not spatial. I mean, I take it that's precisely what you want to deny.
No, what I want to say is... I mean, you have to, really sort of parse out what is being said, right? The idea is that if all you had, okay, the fundamental idea is that if all you had was succession, right, you would lose yourself in the succession. So he wants to say,
music
how
seems
is that...
neither pure succession nor spatiality, right? It seems like a more robust temporal phenomenon that Kant's willing to acknowledge, but it's not spatial either.
But again, he's not making this argument where he wants to say, well, let's just take this one thing. He wants to say, you have all of this, spatial and temporal experience. So, I mean, so what he want to say is this. This would be the thought experiment. Can a being that only hears music, then that's the only thing that they do. They have never had any other experience.
No spatial experience.
No spatial experience, right? Can that being have some kind of sense of time? And what kind of sense of time would it be? So that would be the thought experiment that you would need to
And that seems totally plausible to me.
Right,
so what's the argument for why that's implausible?
I guess it doesn't seem. I mean, I think that at best, what you would have is some kind of a small amount of a retentional consciousness, but not any kind of full-blown temporality, the way that Kant wants to talk about temporality.
But that's essentially a sort of psychological claim. So maybe I misunderstood you, but I took you to be a virtual claim about the dependence.
I'm not just making a psychological claim. This is
but
a
isn't
claim
the
about
claim that if I didn't have musical
okay.
training, I couldn't understand the different notes? Isn't that essentially a psychological claim about a capacity that I have?
What I'm trying to do is defend, Kant's thesis in light of, this example that you're trying to give.
Yeah.
Right?
But it seems like
that's not saying, so it doesn't need to be, all I need to say is that it would not be possible. I don't think it would be possible to have a full-blown understanding of temporality with just hearing musical tones.
You don't have to give a reason for why.
No. Okay. The reason is, that's the other stuff in the paper, right? Is in order for you to be able to understand what temporality is, you do need to have something that remains the same in order to understand what changes. Let me just go back to, actually, with the idea of, with this question of the musical tones. Even if all I have is an awareness of these tones.
Mm-hmm.
I think that even in order for me to have a sense of, to have a sense of that something that flows and not to completely lose myself in it, I do have to have a sense that it is I that I'm hearing. Okay, so all I need, what would you have? Let's suppose that you have an individual, right?
But then
all
that
they
not
have,
going to be spatial. So that's different from the,
right?
the,
No, but
space-time connection, right? This is a different point. This is about the
No, but-
substantiality of the I.
Yeah, no, but they're all connected. They're all connected because he wants to say that the substantiality of the I is going to depend on this necessary synthesis thesis. So, in other words, the issue is you need, the main point is going to be that you need to have something that is permanent in order to understand alteration. That's his point. And if you can say, no, I can just have alteration without the permanent, then, okay, then if you can make a case that you can just have alteration, that you can just be conscious of the alteration without you thinking that I am conscious of alteration. And once you say, I am conscious of alteration, you have the I.
But then we're sort of back to Mark's question. I think the dog has an experience of alteration without thinking, I'm having an experience of alteration. That's what I think. I can't speak for my dog.
Okay.
I have a question that's sort of related to those two. But I wonder if when Kant talks about representations, does his whole view depend on the priority of the sense of sight? Okay, because when you were talking about your dog, okay, I love dogs. I don't have one. I have cats, though. For example, their sense of smell is much stronger than ours. And when you said, doesn't your dog recognize that it's you? Well, I think that it might be that they can smell the difference at least as much as they can see the difference. But I also wonder, could it be that animals just have different faculties than we do? But, we know they see differently. Dogs and cats see motion rather than objects. And that would seem to me to have a lot of applicability to these two questions.
It all depends on what what does he mean by a representation?
Yeah.
And again, so the issue would be that, how is it that when you are knowing or cognizing something, that you don't just lose yourself in what it is that you're cognizing. And in order for you not just to lose yourself, there's some sense that you need an awareness of self as distinct from a representation. And for Kant, there's going to be two representations that don't necessarily need to be spatial or anything. They just are going to be something through. So you can have, like, for instance, music. Music can be a representation. It's just something that stands for something else or points you to something. Right. That's what a representation is. And for Kant, there's going to be there's going to be concepts and intuitions in both the representations. So I would say that probably the animals are just more. They're not going to be having conceptual representations. They're just always relating immediately to things. So.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about memory and what role.
Right. The issue of memory is going to play a very big role. Because that would go into this issue of, can you have a temporal awareness if all you have is music? Is that if all you're hearing is everything that you're hearing is music? And then the issue there's also going to be the issue of what comes first, because for you to even be able to cognize the music, you have to have some sense of rhythm, so that it almost already presupposes the temporality. So there's a whole host of issues there. How do you cognize? How do you know what the rhythm is? Aren't you? Maybe you could say maybe you're already presupposing it. Oh, Cal.
Could you say something about the role of time for Kant in his operation of the imagination? It's fairly easy to understand how time as a form of perception plays itself out.
Mhm.
If anything you perceive in terms of being earlier or later or simultaneous.
Mhm.
All right, there it works. But then you get to the schemata of the imagination. You remember chapter 11,
Mhm.
which ends. The schema of the imagination are nothing but the transcendental determination of time.
Mhm.
What the hell is that about?
I mean, I think that that's just a figurative synthesis, what he's talking about. And why is it a schema of the imagination? It's because you need to be able to, a priori, have a sense of time. So one of the ways in which he talks about imagination is, to think of what is not present. But to be able to generate the whole temporal horizon, right? That is a function of the imagination, and it just is the figurative synthesis. So the figurative synthesis is going to be that necessary synthesis between space and time, and he thinks that it's going to be necessary for you to be able to do that, right? In order to generate that temporal horizon, which is the a priori. And it's that temporal horizon is that in which all possible experience is going to take place.
Okay, that's helpful. But might the synthesis work itself out in a different way in the imagination, because it is at once reproductive and productive, right?
Yeah.
And when you have a schema, which is a kind of context in which you both reproduce the contents of perception and produce what? Produce that which leads to the categories.
Mhm.
You have a temporal span, if you will, a temporal operation vis-a-vis time as that which you pass through in remembering and in projecting, anticipating the categories and somehow reproducing the contents of perception.
I mean, he has, he separates the productive and the reproductive imagination. And for the necessary synthesis thesis, what he really needs to be talking about there is the productive imagination, not the reproductive, because the reproductive already involves empirical content, whereas the productive is just a priori. There's no actual empirical content that you're reproducing. And what he's going to say is that the reproductive imagination, which is necessary for cognition, depends upon the productive imagination. So you can't have a reproductive imagination, right, which is just my ability to reproduce, to reproduce the fact that there's that there, unless I already have all of that productive imagination, everything that's going on with the productive imagination in place.
So sort of picking up on Dr. Strong's comments, it seems like in your paper you talk about the figurative synthesis, which the figurative synthesis, if I understand it correctly, is the productive synthesis of the imagination.
Yeah.
That's the a priori act of the imagination that brings space and time together so that they can be unified, etc. It seems like in your paper you carry over some of Kant's ambiguity from the B version of the deduction, where he sometimes seems to talk about the imagination as a separate thing, but then sometimes seems to place it within the understanding or act as though the figurative synthesis were an act of the understanding. Are they distinct? Can we parse them out? Do you think that maybe that's some conceptual work that needs to be done to pull those out separately so that they are two separate faculties, and so that we keep synthesis as the proper activity of the imagination and then something else for the understanding?
The difference between the imagination and the understanding, I mean, he gives, in the B deduction, he does give some, account of how he's understanding the difference. Is that once you are talking about the imagination, you're already talking about the influence of the understanding on the forms of intuition. So the imagination is just, it's a priori, but it is what the understanding does. I mean, it already has an a priori content. Whereas if you're thinking of the understanding by itself, you're not talking about it working on anything yet.
No, I agree that they're in this chain that allows us to have experience and everything. You can't talk about them totally by themselves. But is the figurative synthesis an act of the understanding on space and time, or is it an act of the imagination on space and time?
It's the act of the understanding on space and time. And you get the imagination when you have all of those. I mean, that's what he says.
Well, then what work is the imagination doing in the B deduction? Are then we left with what Heidegger has to say about the imagination, that by the time we get to the B deduction, we've left it behind? Because if the figurative synthesis is done by the understanding, then why even talk about the imagination?
Well, no, because you can distinguish between, I mean, I think, I'm trying to defend him. You can talk about an understanding, supposedly, that, is not working on, because the space and time are forms of intuition for beings such as ourselves. So that the imagination that he's talking about is already specific towards beings such as ourselves who have the specific capacities that we do. But he's open to there being Slurmians out there, on planet Slurmia. And the Slurmians, would have an understanding, but it wouldn't work on forms of intuition like ours. It would work on some other kind of form of intuition. So he's quite clear about that it really has. So he wants to say that that there can be finite beings that. So there's going to be let's finite beings such as ourselves that that know through representation, right? That are cognized through representations and work on material that is already given to us. So there may be Slurmians that are finite, but they have different forms of intuition.
Right.
So the kind of understanding that is distinguished from ours and from the Slurmians would be the divine understanding. And the divine understanding is what can know a thing in itself.
That's the intuitive intellect.
It's the intuitive intellect because it knows by producing.
Right.
Because it produces what, it knows it in itself. Whereas any intellect or any cognizer that is finite, right? So the Slurmians may have an understanding, but different forms of intuition. They would, insofar as they're finite, they would know through an understanding, right? But that would be working on different kinds of intuition.
No, I grant all that. It's just I guess the simplest form is the understanding and the imagination two different faculties in the B deduction? And does the imagination?
I mean, I guess it depends on what you mean by, all I can say is that he's understanding the imagination as the understanding working on these kinds of, on our kind of forms of intuition.
So then the imagination would be like a species of acts of the understanding, or something like that.
With a particular content, right?
A
particular a priori content.
It would not be a faculty of its own. It would just be a part of it. It would be a specific act of the understanding.
Well, it would be a specific kind of. It would be an understanding that's working on the forms of intuition that he's talking about.
Okay.
I mean, I guess, and if you want to be technical, you could say, well, the Slurmians have their own kind of imagination. I don't, it's just, he's clear in the B deduction there that he wants to say, what I mean by the imagination is just going to be the understanding as it works on these, as it is taking up these forms, right, and working on them. And the reason why I guess he wants to call it a specific faculty is because only if that occurs can you then have the reproductive imagination doing its work. So only if the understanding is already working on, has made this necessary synthesis between the forms of intuition of space and time, only if that has happened, right, can you have an actual reproductive imagination. So maybe that's why he talks about it as if it were, a faculty, because it does so much work. I mean, it has to be in place in order for anything else to occur. That action of the understanding on these forms has to be in place. And then, you can talk about it as an imagination insofar as, again, it generates these, that spatial temporal horizon, which is a priori, right? And it's a product of, insofar as you generate that whole horizon, it's not just what's present, it's also it's the possible, right?
But couldn't it be the case that the imagination is still doing the synthesis and the understanding at the same time as doing something after that's its own work? Couldn't it be the case that the imagination is doing work on space and time such that it can be presented to the understanding? Because if you could, this would rely on, you'd have to be able to read parts of the A deduction into the B in some way to be able to do this.
Right.
Or to understand it this way, which I tend to think you can, but do you personally think that could be
I
a viable
personally
option?
think that what does the work is the understanding. So that it can be confusing to think that there's something different than the understanding is what is doing the synthesizing. But when we talk about the imagination, it just means that you're already talking about what, you're already including that a priori content. So that's what I think, that it is the understanding that's doing the work.
Yeah, but that's an interesting inquiry. Might just explain why in the second edition he left out the significant parts of the imagination. The first edition that addresses these issues more directly in such a way that the workings of the imagination don't simply work in the service of the categories of the understanding.
Okay, can you repeat what you're saying?
And if you don't go right, your Sartre's notion of the imagination is, if you will, a richer notion of the workings of the imagination than you have in a more strictly epistemological framework that you have in at least the first edition.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, once you bring in the reproductive imagination, then, then you're already talking about this ability to reproduce, which has more of the, because again, he thinks of the imagination as that which is going to mediate between the understanding on the one hand, which is pure activity, and sensibility on the other hand, right? So it's this it plays this mediating role.
That reduces the significance of the imagination if it's simply mediating